Imagine this, a parliament, the so-called temple of democracy, where voices of the people should rise and echo through the chambers. In theory, Kenya's National Assembly was meant to be that sacred place, the guardian of the Constitution, the stage where leaders debate the future of millions. But what if that temple has been defiled? What if it no longer belongs to the people, but to one man and his circle of loyalists? That is the question now haunting Kenya. The whispers have become louder. Leaked WhatsApp messages between members of parliament and President William Ruto himself reveal a disturbing truth. Laws are not being debated, they are being dictated. Votes are not free, they are instructed. The House of the People has become the president's echo chamber, rubber-stamping decisions, no matter how destructive they are for ordinary citizens. Kenyans still remember the 2024 finance bill. Crowds poured into the streets protesting against crushing taxes, shouting "No" with one voice. And yet Parliament passed it anyway. Why? Because late at night, a message from the president told MPs how to vote. The people outside were silenced, and the men inside the chamber obeyed. It was not representation, it was betrayal. And here the contrast is impossible to ignore. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré has taken the opposite path. He shocked the world by dissolving institutions that no longer served the people. He declared that if democracy becomes an empty ritual, it must be remade into something real, sovereignty rooted in action, not speeches. While Kenya's parliament hides behind secrecy and collusion, Burkina Faso's young leader calls citizens into the streets to clean their cities, farm their land, and reclaim their dignity. So the question for all of us is simple but urgent. Which path should Africa follow? The path of parliaments captured by power, or the path of leaders willing to risk everything to give power back to the people? Please share your thoughts. Do you still believe Kenya's parliament represents its citizens, or has it become something else entirely? And subscribe if you believe that truth and accountability matter more than empty promises. The first cracks in Kenya's parliament did not appear overnight. They were years in the making, but 2024 became the breaking point. That was when the betrayal of the people moved from whispers in back corridors to evidence written in leaked messages and hurried midnight meetings. To understand the outrage sweeping Kenya today, we must return to the moment when the political stage turned into a theater of shadows. It began with the sudden removal of Deputy President Gashagwa. His dismissal stunned the nation. The decision came not through open debate or transparent inquiry, but in strange late-night sessions where agendas were shifted, custodians of procedure were silenced, and members of parliament were pressured into compliance. Mutus, who was supposed to safeguard the integrity of the agenda, walked away, leaving more questions than answers. Citizens who had trusted the parliamentary process felt betrayed, as though the script of democracy had been rewritten behind closed doors. The evidence did not stop there. Affidavits and documents began to surface, showing how little the people's will mattered when political elites decided otherwise. The chamber that was meant to represent 50 million Kenyans seemed captured by a handful of men at the top. Even those who still defended the process could not ignore the cracks spreading across the foundation. Then came the finance bill of 2024, the moment when anger exploded onto the streets. For weeks, ordinary Kenyans rallied under the hot sun, waving placards, chanting slogans, and demanding that their voices be heard. Mothers marched with their children. Students carried banners declaring, "No more debt, no more taxes." The streets of Nairobi, Kisumu, and Mombasa thundered with a single demand: reject the bill. It was not merely about money. It was about dignity, about whether the people had any say in the future being written in their name. And yet inside the walls of Parliament, a different reality played out. MPs debated, but their debates were hollow. The outcome was already decided. The majority insisted the bill must pass, ignoring the cries outside. Days later, leaked WhatsApp messages revealed the truth behind their determination. At precisely 10:14 p.m., President William Ruto had sent a directive to MPs approve his nominee pass. His bills obey without question. He even cloaked his orders in the language of faith, thanking God while instructing legislators to fall in line. For many Kenyans, that revelation was the ultimate insult. Not only were their voices silenced, but their faith was invoked as a tool of manipulation. The betrayal deepened when a senator bragged in the same group chat that slowing down internet access had saved the government during the GNZ protests. It was a shocking admission. Instead of protecting freedoms, leaders conspired to suppress them. In another thread, Governor Aruno Kangata congratulated the president for pushing through the appointment of a new deputy president after Gashagwa's removal. Even the deputy speaker of parliament was not spared from these exchanges. The circle of complicity was wide, implicating some of the very people sworn to uphold constitutional integrity. For millions of Kenyans, the message was clear: parliament no longer belonged to them. It had become an echo chamber of the president, a rubber stamp for his agenda. Ordinary citizens who once believed their representatives spoke on their behalf now realized that when the president said jump, MPs did not ask why, they only asked how high. And as these events unfolded in Kenya, many Africans could not help but look across the continent to Burkina Faso. There, President Ibrahim Traoré had taken the opposite approach. When institutions stopped serving the people, he did not bend them further into submission. He dissolved them, declaring that sovereignty must come directly from the citizens themselves. Where Kenya's leaders plotted in secret chat groups, Traore held public gatherings calling his people into action, urging them to clean their cities, reclaim their land, and demand accountability. This contrast is striking. In Kenya, secrecy has become the tool of governance. In Burkina Faso, openness and collective labor are redefining what leadership looks like. The clash between these two paths poses a question not just for Kenya, but for Africa as a whole. Will the continent follow leaders who conspire in the dark, or those who dare to stand in the light with their people? The betrayal of Kenya's parliament reached its most explosive moment not in the daytime chambers, but in the glow of mobile phone screens late at night. At 10:14 p.m., when most ordinary families were finishing supper or preparing for bed, a single message from President William Ruto dropped into the WhatsApp group of members of parliament. It was short-framed in the language of gratitude and faith, but its meaning was absolute: approve my nominee, pass my agenda, do not question. For many Kenyans, when this message was later leaked, it became the ultimate symbol of how power had shifted. Parliament was no longer a debating house. It was a group chat waiting for instructions. The sacred ritual of voting, once considered a solemn duty, had been reduced to the click of a phone and the obedience of men and women unwilling to defy their benefactor. The House of the People had been captured, and the evidence was there in writing. But the shock did not end there. In that same digital thread, Senator Aaron Tero openly boasted about how, during the height of the G&Z protests, the government had slowed down internet access to weaken the movement. That saved the day, he wrote. Those few words sent a chill across the nation. If leaders could cut off communication to silence dissent, what other tools might they use next? It was no longer about politics alone. It was about the deliberate erosion of basic freedoms. Reactions erupted instantly. Civil society groups condemned the revelations as proof of collusion at the highest levels. Lawyers warned that Kenya was sliding into authoritarianism under the cover of democratic institutions. Students who had been on the front lines of the finance bill protests felt vindicated. Their suspicions of a system stacked against them had been confirmed. On radio shows and street corners, ordinary citizens voiced a mixture of anger and despair. Some asked whether voting even mattered anymore if elected representatives were nothing more than extensions of the president's will. Inside Parliament itself, the mood was different. Instead of shame, many MPs carried on as though nothing had happened. Some defended the president's right to coordinate his team. Others brushed off the leaks as exaggerated. But the damage had been done. Trust once broken could not be restored by half-hearted denials. Every law passed afterward was met with suspicion. Every appointment was questioned as a political favor rather than a constitutional duty. The international community also took notice. Regional analysts warned that Kenya, long seen as a cornerstone of East African democracy, was treading a dangerous path. The symbolism was heavy. If Kenya's parliament could be reduced to a messaging platform for presidential orders, what did that mean for the idea of representative government across Africa? Diplomats in Nairobi quietly began to recalibrate their assessments, wondering if Kenya's vaunted stability was more fragile than they had believed. And once again, comparisons were drawn with Burkina Faso. Ibrahim Traoré, the young captain turned president, had taken a radically different approach when faced with broken institutions. He did not hide behind secrecy or manipulate systems from the shadows. Instead, he stood before his people and declared, if institutions no longer serve you, they must be dismantled and rebuilt. In Ouagadougou, citizens were called to participate directly in projects that reaffirmed sovereignty, from street cleanups to national housing campaigns. Traoré's leadership was messy, controversial, and risky, but it was transparent. People saw the process unfolding in the open, not whispered through encrypted chats. For many older Africans watching these parallel stories, the contrast was painful. Kenya, with its long democratic tradition, seemed to be sliding backwards into the very manipulation and elite capture it once condemned. Burkina Faso, often dismissed as unstable, was experimenting with new ways to anchor politics in the daily lives of citizens. Which path held more promise for Africa's future? The climax of Kenya's crisis was not simply the revelation of leaked messages. It was the realization that the nation's most sacred institution had been hollowed out. Citizens had fought for decades to secure multi-party democracy, free elections, and constitutional checks. Now they were watching those gains evaporate in real time. The anger that followed was not just about one finance bill or one deputy president. It was about the survival of democracy itself in a country where the parliament had become an extension of the president's phone. When the leaked messages reached the public, the immediate reaction was outrage. But outrage quickly gave way to something far more corrosive: disillusionment. Ordinary Kenyans who had endured hardship with the belief that at least their representatives were a check on power suddenly realized that the very institution designed to defend them had joined the ranks of the oppressors. The civil consequences were stark. Across towns and villages, people began to speak with resignation. We are on our own. It was no longer just about taxes or internet freedom. It was about the collapse of trust. For a mother in Eldoret struggling to buy food for a taxi driver in Nairobi trapped in endless fuel hikes, the parliament no longer appeared as a place of recourse. It was seen as a marketplace of deals, where loyalty to the president was traded for personal favors. Lawyers and civil rights advocates amplified this sentiment. According to lawyer Kiowa, the legislature had transformed into a chamber of rent-seekers politicians willing to sell their integrity for survival. His words struck a chord with the public. A parliament that sexualizes itself for attention parades before the president for approval and abandons any sense of principle is not a parliament at all. It is a stage for humiliation. And humiliation more than oppression is what ordinary Kenyans felt most keenly. Politically, the consequences were equally grave. The finance bill protests had already eroded Ruto's popularity, but the WhatsApp leaks accelerated the erosion of legitimacy for the entire system. Opposition parties seized on the revelations, framing them as proof that Kenya was sliding into a de facto one-party state. Yet even opposition leaders faced skepticism. Citizens asked, if Parliament itself can be captured, what hope is there for any political faction to resist the machinery of power? The streets began to quiet, but not out of acceptance. Rather, it was a silence heavy with despair. Activists warned that such disillusionment is dangerous. When people lose faith in peaceful institutions, they may either withdraw entirely or resort to more radical means. Kenya's history is scarred by episodes of violence born from political frustration. The fear now was that the same conditions were being recreated. Civil society groups tried to fill the vacuum, urging citizens not to surrender their agency. Universities became hotbeds of debate, churches offered platforms for protest, and grassroots organizations sought to build networks outside formal politics. But these efforts struggled against a tide of cynicism. For many, the phrase "Parliament of the People" had become a cruel joke. In contrast, Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré was experiencing the opposite trajectory. By dissolving institutions that no longer served citizens, Traoré invited the public to participate directly in governance. Street cleanups, community farming, even constitutional debates were conducted with ordinary people at the center. It was messy and imperfect, but it rekindled belief. People could see and touch their sovereignty. The juxtaposition could not be sharper. In Kenya, institutions survived, but legitimacy collapsed. In Burkina Faso, institutions were dismantled, but legitimacy grew. For older Africans who had witnessed decades of false promises, the lesson was clear. Survival of institutions means little if those institutions serve only themselves. True survival lies in trust, and trust cannot be legislated through WhatsApp orders. The civil and political consequences of Kenya's parliamentary capture are therefore not confined to the present. They threaten the very fabric of the future. A generation of young Kenyans already cynical about politics now sees confirmation that change will not come from within the system. If this despair hardens, Kenya risks losing not just faith in parliament, but faith in democracy itself. And once that faith is gone, restoring it may be harder than any finance bill or midnight appointment could ever repair. From Washington to Brussels, Kenya has long been portrayed as a cornerstone of stability in East Africa. Western diplomats pointed to Nairobi as proof that democratic institutions could survive in a region often described as turbulent. But the WhatsApp leaks shook that narrative to its core. If Kenya's parliament, the very institution celebrated as a model of checks and balances, could be reduced to a digital echo chamber of presidential orders, what did that mean for America's vision of African democracy? In U.S. policy circles, the revelation sparked uncomfortable debates. American officials had invested heavily in branding Kenya as a democratic partner, especially after the chaos of past elections. Billions in aid and security cooperation hinged on the idea that Kenya was trustworthy, transparent, and representative. Yet the leaked messages suggested the opposite, not a parliament of the people, but one captured by executive power. For older Americans who remember Cold War alliances with friendly strongmen, this carried a haunting echo. Was the United States once again backing leaders who spoke the language of democracy while hollowing it out from within? The European Union faced a similar reckoning. Brussels has long touted Kenya as a partner in trade, climate policy, and counter-terrorism. But the finance bill protests and the internet shutdowns forced uncomfortable parallels with regimes the EU had condemned elsewhere. How could Europe defend freedom of expression abroad while tolerating its suppression in Nairobi? Civil society activists in Kenya were quick to point out the double standard, asking why Western embassies that loudly condemned censorship in Russia or China remained silent when Kenyan protesters were silenced by throttled internet. Beyond policy, the leaks reverberated in global media. International news outlets seized on the symbolism in the digital age. Democracy itself had been captured by a WhatsApp group. The imagery was too powerful to ignore. Headlines in New York, London, and Paris framed Kenya's crisis not as a local scandal, but as part of a broader global struggle over the meaning of democracy. Was democracy about the ritual of voting or about the reality of representation? In this context, Ibrahim Traoré's example in Burkina Faso gained unexpected resonance. To many in the West, Traore had once been dismissed as a populist soldier. But as Kenya's crisis unfolded, commentators began contrasting his blunt transparency with Ruto's secrecy. Traore dissolved institutions that had lost legitimacy. Ruto clung to institutions and twisted them into tools of control. For American and European observers, this raised unsettling questions. Could it be that the stability they prized in Kenya was built on sand, while the upheaval in Burkina Faso pointed to a new, if uncertain, foundation? Global reactions were not uniform. Some policymakers insisted Kenya remained a vital ally and cautioned against overreaction. Others argued that ignoring the erosion of democracy in Nairobi would only embolden authoritarian tendencies across Africa. Within African diaspora communities in the United States, the debate was even sharper. Many older African Americans, remembering their own struggles for civil rights, expressed solidarity with Kenyans who felt betrayed. They asked whether America, which claims to defend democracy worldwide, could afford to remain silent when democracy faltered so visibly in one of its closest African partners. Ultimately, the world's gaze on Kenya became a mirror. For America and Europe, it forced reflection on their alliances and their selective defense of democratic principles. For Africa, it highlighted the stark contrast between leaders who manipulate from the shadows and leaders who dare to confront broken systems openly. And for ordinary viewers everywhere, it posed a simple but profound question. If democracy can be reduced to a midnight message on a phone, then what does democracy truly mean? Kenya's parliament was once described as the temple of the Constitution. But today, the illusion has been shattered. The leaked messages showed the nation and the world that behind the speeches and ceremonies, decisions were being made with the tap of a phone screen. Laws that affect millions were not born of debate, but of obedience. Citizens were not represented. They were managed. For many, this realization felt like a betrayal far deeper than any tax increase or broken promise. It was the betrayal of democracy itself. The warning signs are clear. When parliaments become echo chambers, when internet access can be throttled to silence dissent, when faith is invoked to justify political orders, then the fabric of democracy begins to unravel. And once trust collapses, it is far harder to rebuild than to destroy. Kenya is now standing at a crossroads. Continue down a path where institutions exist only in name, or summon the courage to reclaim true sovereignty from below. Across the continent, Africans are watching. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré has chosen a dangerous but daring path, dismantling institutions that no longer serve the people and replacing them with direct forms of participation. Street cleanups, land reforms, even constitutional debates have been handed back to citizens. To some, it looks chaotic. To others, it looks like renewal. But at the very least, it is honest. There are no secrets hidden in WhatsApp groups, no late-night decrees whispered in the dark. The people are present, visible part of the struggle, and so the contrast could not be sharper. Kenya represents the risk of holding on to hollow forms of democracy, while Burkina Faso represents the hope of reinventing it altogether. Which direction will Africa choose? Which model will inspire the next generation? Secrecy and collusion, or transparency and shared sacrifice? For those of us watching from afar, the question is just as urgent. Do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's reform strategies are truly effective yet? Or should nations like Kenya look for a different kind of leadership to guide them out of the crisis? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe that Kenya's parliament still belongs to the people, or has it become something else entirely? Subscribe if you believe that truth must always speak louder than power and that accountability is not a privilege but a right. And share this video if you feel that Africa's story deserves to be told without filters, because the world needs to hear it. The stakes are high not only for Kenya but for the entire continent. The struggle for sovereignty is not just a political battle. It is a battle for dignity, for truth, and for the simple promise that power should always serve the people, never the other way around.